As I've made clear quite a few times now, I'm a big fan of the PSP game Crush. I love its atmosphere, I love its mind-bending puzzles, I love picking it apart at a technical level to try to figure out the fastest way to beat each level. It's just a game that really resonates with me on a lot of levels. But even I can admit, yeah, Crush was not the most popular game when it came out, and like a lot of other PSP games, it just sort of got lost to the sands of time. I mean, like, besides Patapon, Locoroco, and Daxter, what PSP exclusives can you name off the top of your head? The PSP, as much as I love it, didn't really leave that big of an impact outside of its original release, at least not when I was growing up. I had exactly one friend who had a PSP, and I pretty much never saw him use it. Critics did enjoy Crush for its surprisingly intricate story and unique art style, but it never really took off with most other audiences. If there was any PSP exclusive that deserved another chance and didn't have the blessing of Sony to get them off the ground, it was probably Crush. Apparently the developers agreed with me, as in early 2012 we received Crush 3D for the 3DS. To try and solve the issue of the original didn't sell super well, Zoe Mode opted to change things up for this new release, but like, there's such things changing too much, you know? I don't particularly like Crush 3D, that's something I've stated a couple times before, but I never really elaborated any further than that. Today I'd like to delve into what I feel Crush 3D fails at, some things it did right, and why I feel that it loses a lot of the soul of the original in order to try to appeal to a wider audience. Of course, before we dive in, I'd like to make it abundantly clear that this entire video is extremely opinionated by nature. In the end, my opinions don't matter that much, and I'm talking about a 12-year-old 3DS game that nobody but me cares about, made by a development team that doesn't exist anymore. This isn't like a hate-fueled rant about a game that I truly despise, it's just something that I have a lot of interest in discussing. If you like Crush 3D, please tell me. I'd be happy to hear your reasoning. Not only that, but I also just need more Crush fans to talk to. Also, if you never played the original PSP version, or haven't watched my other two videos about Crush, a lot of what I'm about to say might not make a whole lot of sense, so I'd recommend you watch those first. With that out of the way, let's get started! The first thing you'll notice about Crush 3D upon starting it up is the fact that it looks completely different. While the PSP version's art style was extremely cool and unique compared to most other games at the time, I do kinda get how it would be taken as somewhat uninviting. It is a very abrasive and grotesque art style, and while that's something I really like about it, I can get why it'd push some people away. That being said, this new art direction sands off all the edges of Crush to make it as soft and appealing as possible, and makes it blend in a lot more with other games on the platform. It leaves the game with no identity of its own, and is extremely bland in comparison to the warped, dark, and twisted atmosphere of the PSP version. I also take issue with what they did with the cockroaches. The roaches were admittedly one of the grodiest parts of the original Crush, so I understand why they do away with that for this version. But like, they only went halfway with this. They reused the original model of the roaches, but just removed all the textures and replaced them with flat colors instead. It just ends up looking unfinished, and it still doesn't solve the problem they were trying to fix here. I remember when I played the demo of this game as a kid, the roaches still freaked me out and I didn't like looking at them. No one wins here! Even other hazards, like blockwalkers and slugs, remain largely unchanged, only getting a simple retexture. The slugs do admittedly look a lot better than the roaches, but it's still reusing a model that appears to be a bit unnerving to young audiences. The style also contributed a lot to the story of the original, as Danny was trying to cure his chronic insomnia, so everything looked nightmarish to him. This softer style probably wouldn't work well with a story like that, so the story was rewritten. You still play as a guy named Danny, and a mad scientist puts you into a machine called Crush, but instead of Rubens, we have Dr. Doc Dockerson. He and Danny have supposedly been friends for years, I'm guessing in a similar fashion to Marty McFly and Doc Brown. Doc has been putting Danny through the ringer for who knows how long, making him the guinea pig for all his weird inventions. The vibe you got from Danny and Rubens' relationship was that it was all very alienating, which worked well for the darker tone of the original. Here, things are a lot goofier, and while it works for the tone of Crush 3D, I personally don't find it nearly as compelling. Instead of Danny having some sort of personal motivation to be using Crush, it just feels very hollow here. Danny's doing this just because, I guess. As stupid as this sounds, I really did want to see where the story went in the PSP version. It kept me a lot more interested. The PSP version was also fully voice acted, and the performances were astonishingly good.
Then again, what kid dreams about being hospitalized for insomnia? Or dreams of a cure like this? This is a cure, right?
Here we just get plain old text boxes, which is way lamer. I guess the 3DS couldn't handle holding all those voice clips, which makes sense, I suppose. Maybe they didn't feel like paying all the voice actors again. Okay, this is actually me writing, this is like me post-writing that script. this is just like off the cuff while I'm recording these audio lines. I've been playing Shin Megami Tensei 4 recently, and that came out, give or take, like, only a year later. It was May 23rd, 2013. That shit is fully voice acted.
You're reading? Isabeau, don't tell me you're a devotee of that literature too.
I'm sorry, but what? What I was reading is something called manga.
For the most part, at least. And that game has way more dialogue than Crush ever did. So I'm thinking maybe they just were lazy and didn't feel like re-recording all the voice lines and paying all the voice actors again. That's my guess, because, I mean, SMT 4 fully voice acted on the 3DS a year later. They could do it. One last thing I'd like to talk about in regards to the new style is the music. I've always praised Crush for its trippy, unnerving soundtrack, which, yeah, I'll admit isn't for everyone, but you can at least admit it contributes a lot to the nightmarish atmosphere it was trying to build. So for this re-release that was trying to go for a softer style with wide appeal, what did they do? They changed exactly none of it. With only one exception, all the music is the exact same, which no longer makes sense in the context of this new art style or story. The only new track they did for Crush 3D was the title screen theme, and I'll admit that I do really like this track. It's pretty chill, and really fits the blue city scenery you see when you first boot up the title screen. Plus, I harbor a lot of nostalgia for this. I remember booting up the demo just to listen to this song as a kid. I'm glad they got the original composer to come back just for this one song. It still has the same vibe of the PSP version soundtrack, while still absolutely working for the new style they were trying to go for. If only they went the full mile and did the rest of the soundtrack like that. Well, at the very least, art style isn't everything. They may have cut all the thorns of the original, but at its core, this is still Crush we're talking about. All the gameplay and level designs are still intact. Right? I think if I have to phrase a sentence like that, you should probably already know the answer. In the PSP version, each world has 10 levels, and you only had to finish 6 levels in each world to unlock the next. This gave you a bit of freedom to hop around if you were struggling with one level in particular, which is helpful in the later worlds where things start to spike up in difficulty. Some of those later levels in each world get really tricky too, so they worked well as bonuses that you could choose to skip if you were having trouble. Crush 3D decided this wasn't necessary, and now every level must be finished to beat the game. Not only that, but you also don't get any freedom with level order. To gain access to the next level, you have to beat the one you're currently on. I guess they thought this was a bit mean, so to make up for it, they just removed certain hazards from the game. Not from the level, but from the entire game. Hazard blocks, alarm clocks, and cages have all been removed, making certain level designs either trivial or more frustrating than before. Out the Frying Pan has this part at the very beginning where you have to catch a roach in a cage to progress, but here you have to awkwardly shuffle around it to progress, and it feels really hit or miss whether you can get by or not. On the other hand, Dive In's alarm clock has been removed, making this part where you have to jump down again feel a lot less necessary and more just like repeating something for the sake of repeating it. Except that was actually a lie, because they messed something else up that it just invalidates this entire level. I mentioned in the first Crush video that the PSP version's controls were a little clunky, but that the game was designed around this. You weren't meant to be able to jump around certain parts of the levels, as it would invalidate the intended puzzle. This is why things like corner jumps in the 90% speedrun are really difficult, but really rewarding if you can actually pull them off. It feels really satisfying to outsmart the original intent of the designers by just barely doing something that they didn't account for. I guess a lot of people complained about this heavier movement though, because for Crush 3D, the controls were completely reworked. Danny now has the air mobility of Super Mario World, and can turn on a dime no matter if he's on the ground or in the air. This can be used to absolutely cheese a lot of level designs, which I'm usually all for. I think having open-ended solutions to puzzles is almost always a good thing. In the context of something like a speedrun, I do find Crush 3D's physics pretty fun to experiment with. But from a design standpoint, this honestly feels kinda lazy. When you found out a cheesy way to skip something in Crush PSP, it really felt like you were outsmarting the devs of their own game, thinking of something they didn't account for. Whereas here, it just feels like they forgot to update the levels to account for their new systems and didn't feel like going through all the effort of changing anything. Also, one last minor issue that would only bother me and no one else, there's no in-game timer for each level in Crush 3D. This makes timing individual levels for speedruns way more annoying, since you have to do them all with your own timer. I know it's exactly how it's done for other games, but I find the in-game timer of Crush PSP to be really convenient for that exact thing, and it bothers me that it's not here this time. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the new things they added in Crush 3D. First, you can now unlock unique outfits for Danny, and I will say that I do really love this. I love unique skins in pretty much any game, and you'll never catch me playing as the default color of any character if I have the option for something else. It's a fun reward for going for 100%, and there's a lot of unique patterns here. There's also a good chunk of outfits you can only unlock using gift points, which can be gotten using the next new feature. As this was an early 3DS title, we now have Street Pass support. At any point during a level, you can click this little button on the bottom screen to place a gift. If you Street Pass with someone else who also has Crush 3D, that gift will appear in the same spot in their game and they can collect it to get some gift points, as well as getting a completion mark on the level for some reason. I don't know why they gave each level its own blanked out present marker as if there's one in each level you're supposed to collect. It makes it feel like each level's incomplete to me, even if I've gotten everything in it. There's also the new frame cam mode, which I will say is a very good addition. Lets you zoom in and out, place markers on any part of the level, and pan the camera. This was something I felt the free cam mode in the PSP version really needed, as pretty much all it let you do was just rotate the level around. No zoom, no nothing. In a game as complex and puzzling as Crush, having a better view of what you're trying to solve is always appreciated. Then, we have 2 new tutorial levels, I guess? Even though one of them is just a portion of another tutorial level split off into its own level. And that's it. That's the only new stuff that was added. It makes me wish that they had done more with the opportunity they had when revamping Crush like this. In my last video, I mentioned that there was originally planned to be a level editor in the PSP version, but they just didn't have the time to tune up what they had into something more user-friendly. Now that they were making a new version of the game, on a console with a touchscreen that probably would have been perfect for making levels, they still didn't do anything with this idea. Again, I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, and maybe there was something putting them on a time crunch, or maybe the budget was lower than the original, I'm not sure. Still, it would have been cool to see this idea manifest in this version. If there's anything I can appreciate Crush 3D for, it's that, in the end, it did accomplish what it set out to do. Whenever I meet someone else who's heard of or played Crush, they've almost always told me they found it through the 3DS demo that they put on the eShop. Hell, that even applies to me! I downloaded the demo for this game back in like 2012 and only found the PSP version years later when I was looking through a ROM site in 2020. But at the same time, having the most well-known version of this game be a watered-down port that has none of the spunk or the soul of the original really bugs me. At the very least, Crush 3D is still Crush at its core. It retains most of the core gameplay, and in reality, a lot of my points here are just nitpicks that would only bother an ultra nerd like me. If your only way of playing Crush is through the 3DS version, then have at it. I just personally believe that the pros of the PSP version severely outweigh the pros of Crush 3D. But in the end, none of that matters, because in Crush 3D I can adorn Danny with cows.